Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. In this lesson, from Unit 3, American Federalism, we'll have Lesson 8 about Madison's mistake. In this lesson, you'll learn about the anti-federalist called Brutus, about cooperative expansion, gradual expansion, and Madison's mistake. In the previous lesson, we developed a model of Madison's checks and balances in the context of American federalism. You can see it here. We have, in the small gray circle in the middle, a representation of the government of the United States of America. Now it's small because the national government's a government of limited, enumerated, delegated powers. The large white circles surrounding it are the powers that were delegated to the states and retained by them when the national government was created, what we can call the police powers. And then the thin gray ring around the white circle are those rights that were retained by the people when they created the state governments and turned most powers over to them. Now, Madison and other people in the founding generation realized that this national government that was created had the potential to step beyond its bounds, to expand its powers where they shouldn't be. So he suggested that a solution to that problem would be to create structures in the government that would cause the government to internally check itself. His famous checks and balances. We divide the government up into 3 branches, give them each powers to fight with each other, and in that way they would keep each other in place. As one branch tries to expand its power, the other branches would push back against it, keeping it where it's supposed to be. At the end of the lesson, where we created this model, we then asked this question: will Madison's precautions work to keep his auxiliary precautions, his extra precautions, work to keep the national government where it's supposed to be, keep it within its limited, enumerated, delegated powers? Well, remember, when the Constitution was proposed, not everyone accepted the idea that it would work well. There were the Federalists who supported the idea of this new Constitution. There were the Anti-Federalists who opposed it. One of the big reasons that the Anti-Federalists opposed this new Constitution was they doubted that the national government would remain restrained within its assigned powers. They were worried that it would expand out and eventually gobble up the powers of the states. Among the Anti-Federalists was a man that we know in our modern world only as Brutus. We only know him as that because he wrote a series of letters to newspapers in New York opposing ratification of the Constitution. But he did so under the anonymous pseudonym Brutus. Now, some historians have guessed that the author who went by Brutus is actually a man named Robert Yates, a politician from New York who eventually would become a member of New York's Supreme Court. But we don't know this for sure. Robert Yates is one of several possibilities of who Brutus could have been. We, to this day, don't know who he really was. So it's just a guess. So from this point forward, we won't identify him when we discuss Brutus as any particular person. We'll just refer to him by his anonymous name, Brutus. Now, you may be curious about why he chose the name Brutus. It was typical for people at this time period when they had to write letters to the editor, really, talking about some controversial issue, to use anonymous names, what we call pseudonyms. Brutus took his name when he responded to some other anonymous author who had called himself Caesar. But Brutus's letters were not primarily an argument with Caesar. He ended up arguing primarily with someone going by the name Publius. Publius was an anonymous name used by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, who all wrote together in support of the Constitution. Brutus ended up having an ongoing argument in the newspapers in New York with Publius, who was Madison, Hamilton, and Jay. But we still don't know who Brutus was. Now, Brutus is relevant to us here because he had some great insights into what Madison may have been mistaken about when he made his argument about how the national government would be restrained through checks and balances. Now, recall that when Madison made that argument about checks and balances, he said that people who would seek out offices in government would be ambitious people. They'd want to enlarge their power, and that the structure of government would use that ambition to counteract ambition. So as one person in government, one branch of government, tried to expand its power, the other branches would push back against it. Well, Brutus seemed to agree with Madison that the people who came into the national government would be ambitious. He said that they would want to extend their power and enlarge the sphere of their authority. Now, you may notice at the bottom of this quote where it says Brutus and then the Roman numerals for 11. That means the 11th of Brutus's letters that he wrote. Okay, so Brutus believed that, like Madison, people entering government would be, in a sense, power hungry. These power-hungry politicians would seek to expand the authority of their office, and by doing so expand the power of the entire government. Madison and Brutus both agreed about that. But Madison then, as we said now several times already, believed that that ambition would be used to check and balance each other. As they pushed out their own power, they would invade the power of other politicians who would push back, and in that way they would keep each other in check. Brutus disagreed about this. He said that these politicians would come to recognize that the extension of one of their sets of power would in fact increase the power of others. In particular, an extension of the power of the legislature, as he puts here, in other words, Congress expanding its powers beyond what are assigned to it, would have the effect of increasing the powers of the courts, thus giving the courts an incentive to say okay about Congress expanding its power. So Brutus thought that politicians being hungry for power, rather than fighting against each other, would learn to cooperate with each other to expand their power. Now, the way to see why this would work is to go back to an argument that we made in a previous lesson. In that previous lesson, I pointed out that if you assign Congress only enumerated powers to pass laws, that then the president, the executive branch, will only have limited power because they can only execute or enforce the laws that Congress has passed. And the courts would then be limited in their power because they can only judge whether or not you've obeyed laws that Congress has passed. So effectively, by enumerating or limiting the powers of Congress, you have really limited the powers of all three branches. Brutus changes this line of reasoning with his original premise. And that is what he saw happening is rather than the courts being restrained, rather than Congress being restrained to its enumerated powers, and thus in effect restraining the other branches also, that instead the courts would reinterpret the Constitution to let Congress pass new laws beyond what its powers originally were. So now think about that. This reinterpreting part is actually important. It's something we'll talk about a lot more later in the course. So while Congress is supposedly limited to its powers listed in the Constitution, if the courts simply give new meaning to those things listed in the Constitution, then they effectively give Congress new powers. Now, why would they do that? Because when they let Congress have new powers to make laws in new areas, then the president gets to enforce things in those new areas. His powers effectively been expanded at the same time. And the courts then get to judge whether or not we've obeyed the laws in those new areas. So their powers effectively been expanded too. So in this way, by the courts allowing Congress to expand its power, they've actually expanded the power of all three branches of government. So what we have here can then be seen in our diagram. While Madison thought that the branches of government would internally check each other, and we can take that circle that represented the national government and now expand it out to take a closer look at it, while he thought that they would internally check each other, Brutus thought that they would not, that they would cooperate instead. And what would they cooperate to do? They would cooperate to expand their power outward, away from each other. They wouldn't worry about interfering with each other because instead they could cooperate to gobble up power elsewhere. So if we take what Brutus thought would happen and now insert convert that into our larger diagram, this is what we see. Instead of Madison's solution of the government internally checking itself and keeping itself from where it is supposed to be, instead the branches of government would cooperatively expand their power outward. Now notice what happens when they're expanding their power outward. They are actually gobbling up power that belongs to the states. So, the branches of the national government actually have an incentive to cooperate, to usurp, in other words, illegitimately take away reserved powers of the states. It seems that Madison's checks and balances aren't really going to work because the branches of government have an incentive to not fight against each other, but instead help each other and collectively grow their power together. But what if the voters know this happening? Remember, Madison said that the voters should be the ultimate check on government. They should recognize these things taking place and try to stop it. Well, Brutus thought he had an answer to that too. He said that the judges would extend the power of the government gradually by a slow accumulation of precedents, and that then the legislature, in other words, the Congress, would use the sanction of those proceedings, in other words, the legitimacy provided by Supreme Court decisions, as a cover for what they did. So basically what he's saying is that Congress had overstepped its boundaries just a little bit. Someone would complain, oh my gosh, Congress took away powers that belong to the states that are reserved to them. Congress is violating the 10th Amendment. Congress is going beyond its enumerated powers. They would complain and they would go to court to sue about it. And this decision would eventually come from the United States Supreme Court, which would say, oh, no. That's actually okay what Congress did. You see, if you read that part of the Constitution just a little bit differently, we can kind of make that power fit. So they would reinterpret things to say okay to that overstepping. Then the Congress would use that okay from the court to step a little bit farther. Again, someone would complain. In another case, go to the Supreme Court, and again, the Supreme Court would say, oh, no, that's okay. Yeah, they're all right. And in this way, slowly, the power would grow. With the only people that are really noticing it are the people who are actually parties to these cases, where this overstepping of power has personally affected their life and they brought the lawsuit. The general public's not going to notice it to then get upset and try to stop it. This is like the notion of boiling a frog. I don't know if you've ever heard this analogy before, but this is the way it goes. Supposedly, if you had a pot of boiling water and tried to throw a frog in it, it would immediately sense how hot the water was and jump away. But if you instead put the frog in a comfortable pot of water and set it on the stove and slowly heat it up, the frog won't notice that it's getting gradually warmer until it's too late and he's been boiled and can't get out. Well, that's the idea that Brutus thought would happen with the courts expanding Congress's power. They would do it so gradually over time that by the time people realized what was going on, it'd be too late. So this gradual accumulation of judicial precedents coming from the Supreme Court would then provide the pretext or the excuse for Congress and the national government as a whole, expanding its power and taking reserved power from the states, or in other words, usurping or illegitimately getting power that doesn't belong to them. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. First of all, who was Brutus? Was he a Revolutionary War traitor? An anonymous anti-federalist? A presidential assassin? Or a Revolutionary War hero? Brutus was an anonymous anti-federalist who thought that there were flaws in the Constitution that he tried to expose. What did Brutus realize about political ambitions? Did he realize that they would check each other? That they would cooperate to expand their power? That they served the public interest? Or that they cancel each other out? Unlike Madison, Brutus thought that ambitious people in government would cooperate to expand their power, knowing that it's better for them to not fight with each other and take power from other people, particularly the states. How does Congress then justify this expansion of power? Do they do it through enumerated powers, through national supremacy, through Supreme Court precedents, or through the 10th Amendment? Brutus said that they would do it through Supreme Court precedents. Essentially, Congress would expand its power and the Supreme Court would say, that's okay, and they'd keep doing it. So what was Madison's mistake? Was it that he thought ambition would fight against ambition? Or that vetoes are ineffective? Or that judicial review limits power? Or was it that he didn't realize that ambition cooperates to expand? It's the last one, that he didn't seem to realize that ambitious people would learn to cooperate to expand their power. That does it for this lesson. Our next lesson from Unit 3 will be Lesson 9 about Hamilton's Bank.